Well, good evening, everyone, and certainly, as was prayed by Brother Greg, it is truly my privilege to be here tonight and to be your speaker once again. As we looked last night at some things pertaining to geologic principles, some things that we will ultimately build upon, but not necessarily required for understanding the rest of our lessons, including tonight's, we did talk about really the competing two worldviews that are very important for us to recognize today. There's obviously the Christian worldview, which uses the Bible as the principles for which we base our faith, for which also has a number of things that are written within it very clearly about an earth that had a beginning, a genesis that is very much different from that which is taught in the school systems and the textbooks today. The popularized view today is an ancient earth that would go back some 4.5 billion years to its beginning, almost 12 billion years for the beginning of our cosmos. And when we read in the book of Genesis, though, we read that some generations ago, that last at least according to dating through the genealogies of the Bible, at least 6,000, maybe longer, years ago, that God created the heavens and the earth, according to Genesis chapter 1 and verse 1. And so two very different and contrasting views. And when we looked at those principles last night, we looked at how the uniformitarian view of an earth that is slowly evolving, that is a slow process, which must be ancient because of that particular hypothesis, is one of the things that we need to take into consideration. But we looked last night that there's truly cases of geologic evidence that there has been huge catastrophic events on this earth that would actually compete with that view and help us to put in perspective that in fact there's been some very large scale flooding events in the geologic record. And so we didn't necessarily go out to prove the biblical flood last night. What we did is we built a case that it is possible and in fact probable. Tonight though, what we're going to look at is we're going to look at one of the evolutionary icons, dinosaurs. We're going to look at what we find about dinosaurs and what has been discovered about dinosaurs to certain degrees, but especially tonight I want us to understand the history of dinosaurs. So tonight it's not only a geologic lesson, and it will get to be a biblical lesson later in our sermon, but we want to start with really a history lesson because I think it's very important to know the history of how dinosaurs were discovered to put a proper perspective of how mankind came to understand and appreciate dinosaurs such as we do today. So the question, or two questions we have posted here, is did dinosaurs live in biblical times or did they become extinct 65 million years ago, which is taught in the textbooks today? Well, a couple of questions that we're going to ultimately look at, common questions that are asked about dinosaurs all the time, are these. Did dinosaurs really exist? There are some today that believe that dinosaurs, because they're simply fossils, there's never been any evidence of them living today, at least from their perspective, that they never existed. And these are people who actually hold a biblical worldview. They believe that all things found in the fossil record were just simply that. They were created as part of the fossil record. But there are those who believe that they existed, and we'll talk about that. How did dinosaurs become extinct, for instance? How did that occur? We won't spend a lot of time on that, but we will touch on it because it is important to note. What were dinosaurs like? Obviously, if you're one that has gone to see the newest blockbuster that's out there today, Jurassic World, there is a lot of speculation as to how dinosaurs were and how they would have interacted if there was a human presence along with them in coexistence. Who discovered dinosaurs and how were they discovered? That's where we'll start here this evening. How old are dinosaur fossils? We'll touch on that lightly. We don't have a lot of time to talk about it, but I think it's important to at least note. Did dinosaurs and humans ever coexist? That's something that will be very important that we'll conclude our lesson on here this evening. And our discovery is still being made today. We'll look at an example and what its ramifications are. And what do we really know about dinosaurs today? Well, the earliest known discoveries of dinosaurs go back some 3,000 years to Chinese history. It is reported in Chinese literature that at 3,000 years ago, supposedly the Chinese used what they called dragon teeth, which they would find and they would grind up and they would use medicinally. And they would use it in certain powder forms for certain anecdotes. Well, the thing is about that is we don't necessarily know if they were real dragon teeth, or if they were possibly even fossilized dragon or dinosaur teeth. But that is the earliest record we find anything resembling dinosaurs in the ancient record. Then we find in 1676, this is the first and foremost real discovery that relates to dinosaurs that we have well documented today. An individual by the name of Reverend Robert Plott ultimately found what he considered to be a giant thigh bone. And the reason I put giant there in parentheses is that he thought it was a resemblance of possibly the giants of the Old Testament. Of course, he being a reverend, a person that was associated with the church and having a biblical worldview, he tried to put it in the biblical context. That when you find a bone that isn't related to any animal of the day, maybe this giant thigh bone, which stood, 4 to 5 feet high, it may be representative of the giants back in the ancient times. And so that was what he thought. That's what he ultimately wrote down and published in according to his work. So unfortunately, the application was incorrect, but when individuals went back and looked at that thigh bone many years later, they knew that it was a part of the dinosaur record, fossil record. Well, in 1770, around the time of our Revolutionary War here in the United States, a French anatomist by the name of Georges Cuvier described a large skull found at a local quarry as a monstrous marine lizard. And the reason he did so is because it resembled that of a lizard, but on a much larger scale. Well, in 1796, some 26 years later, Cuvier argued that these fossils were the remains of an extinct species no longer in existence on the earth today. And he did that correctly. He truly was applying what he knew, but he still didn't know exactly which animal it was. And Cuvier was a taxonomist, so he understood what bones were supposed to look like, what animals were to look like, because he had put together and reassembled many animals in his day. And so really the early beginnings of biological sciences. And so he took what he applied from that study, and then he put it up to the larger scale bones, which he found to be, that he just thought, simply some larger lizard species that was no longer alive. Well, the first accurate publications, and you'll notice I put accurate in a semi-quote there, and we'll talk about that here in just a moment, but were large bones and teeth discovered near Oxford, England in 1818. And so we're moving forward a little bit. We're still before Civil War time here in the United States, but we're in the early 1800s. Was ultimately, these bones were shown to an individual by the name of William Buckland. And William Buckland was a clergyman and a university professor at Oxford near this particular quarry site. What's interesting, and you'll start to see some repeat of this, but you'll notice that those in theology often were also naturalists. And that will even be the case, as we'll notice a little bit later on, about Charles Darwin. Individuals who ultimately came through the schools of theology became naturalists to support their ministry work. And the reason is because they were obviously drawn towards God's creation. They wanted to understand it more, not only in the text of the Bible, but also in the living experience of those things observed here on earth. And so it was a natural fit. And they always and constantly put it in a biblical context, at least up until the point of Darwinian theory. Well, in 1824, after consulting with Cuvier, who then becomes the father of paleontology, or the study of ancient life, Buckland published his discovery of this extinct species he referred to as Megalosaurus, which means big reptile. And we'll talk about here in a minute why I've got the quotes once again with regard to this particular species. Well, there's other related science that comes into play during this time. This is a huge time in science. There's a lot of discoveries taking place. There's a lot of theories being proposed, and things are starting to change in human thought process about worldviews. Originally, the biblical worldview was a very strong one. But now there are scientific proponents who are starting to challenge that worldview and starting to introduce the idea of an ancient earth. It began in 1795 with a Scottish naturalist by the name of James Hutton, who wrote Theory of the Earth, in which he stated that the earth was ancient based on slow processes. We talked about him a little bit last night. He ultimately based all of these thoughts on very slow erosion rates of things that he documented during his lifespan. Well, in 1830, building on Hutton's ideas, Charles Lyell, who becomes the father of geology, and this gives you a sense of the idea of how young this science is. Geology was just getting its beginnings in the early 1800s, writes Principles of Geology and argues that the present is the key to the past. We talked about that last night. That things observed today must be the way things have always been, or at least very similar. Meaning, if we look out in a stream today and we don't see a lot of erosion and a lot of deposit, that stream must be at least hundreds of thousands of years old, because surely it couldn't have changed very rapidly over time based on the observations of today. And he noted these things regarding not only sedimentary layers, but fossils, but not necessarily dinosaur fossils, but marine fossils, smaller things like brachiopods, which are just shelled organisms we even find today along our shorelines. And so he said this was all evidence of an ancient earth. Well, the science continues with regard to dinosaurs. Certain discoveries are starting to be made, and by 1840, numerous examples of dinosaur figures or large lizard-like creatures have been discovered and are starting to be documented and studied fairly regularly. Unfortunately, the specimens recovered were only pieces of the larger picture. When I say pieces of the larger picture, I mean it looks like this. There's part of a vertebrae that was discovered in a quarry. Here's a large femur bone. Here's a part of a tail. Again, some more pieces of bone that is related to the skeletal features. But as you can see, they're just pieces. And so from these pieces, you have to inject a lot of hypotheses or opinion about what this animal could possibly be or look like. Well, we finally find the birth of the dinosaur coming in 1841. We're just a few years before the Civil War. And or actually the beginnings of the Civil War, or excuse me, I'm going to get my numbers right here in a minute here. Timeline-wise, we're 20 years before our Civil War. A British anatomist by the name of Sir Richard Owen suggests a new classification of this order of species that has been talked about for a couple of decades now, and which people are still trying to identify with as to what extinct species this is, and is it truly of the lizard species. Owen suggested a new taxonomy, which he called dinosaurs. Here's the first time the word is used in history. The word dinosaurs, or fearfully great reptiles, also meaning terrible lizards, is born 1841. And remember that. Not long after, dinosaurs become all the rave amongst the scientific community and the general public alike. They start actually not only being talked about in the science journals, but they start to be headlines in the newspapers, and then also comes the opportunity for them to be publicly viewed. Their first public appearance is in 1854. In 1854, more than 24 life-size concrete sculptures are unveiled at the Crystal Palace Park in London, which took place during what was a predecessor to the World's Fair. And so an opportunity to take advantage of all these people coming to learn about the new technologies and techniques in agriculture and industry. We're going to see these life-size sculptures for the first time. What do they look like? Well, they look like these. Here is a representation of megalosaur. Here's a representation of what was called iguanodon, the second published dinosaur. And then here's plesiosaurs and ichthyosaurs here represented. Well, look here at megalosaur. And notice here, and I know it's a little bit fuzzy here, but what was the premise, or what was the discovery that ultimately led to this representation? Because I'm going to ask you right now, have you ever seen this in any of your textbooks today? Well, the answer is no. You won't see it because it never really existed. What the discovery that was made that ultimately led to this interpretation was based on that jawbone fragment in 1824. That's all that was found in that quarry. Now, I'm going to ask you a question. What kind of science takes that and creates that? Well, there's some science. Obviously, it has to be discovered. But you know what? Science is highly interpretive. And sometimes there is a lot of artistic interpretation that goes into science. And we're going to see some of that as we go through here. Well, let's skip over here to iguanodon. There was never anything else found with regard to megalosaur. Later was found to be a completely different species, and ultimately they associate it with a totally different dinosaur today. Well, here's what's called iguanodon. Notice it looks like an iguana. Again, what did humans do? They took what they knew, they applied what they knew, and they came up with something that looked like something they were familiar with. Well, has there ever been a dinosaur that looks like iguanodon? No. But it was based on these few bones in 1825. A broken piece of a femur, a couple of teeth, a couple of pieces of rib. That's it. That's all that was found. And that's what was published, but yet this interpretation of an iguana-like dinosaur came to be the fact of those days. Later, in 1840, some more bones were found, but it was found looking just like this in the stone quarry of the slab that was taken in for examination. How do you get from that to this? Again, artistic interpretation. You have to be able to imagine things, and when you imagine things, it's no longer science, and you have to be very cautious about that. All right, so let's talk about the origins and evolution perspective, because right during this time, an individual comes along and is going to challenge the original belief that dinosaurs, like all other creatures, ultimately became fossilized or part of the rock record in these large bones being found in the rocks due to a result of what's called the Noachian diluvium. And if you don't know what the Noachian diluvium is, it's Noah's flood. But in the science world, you never want to make mention of Noah's flood because that's dangerous to the scientists, especially those who believe in an atheistic standpoint and believe in evolution. So if you're ever looking for Noah's flood, you can't go look for Noah or flood. You got to look for Noachian diluvium, something of that fanciful way of saying it. However, the new theory that develops comes out by Charles Darwin in 1859, just prior to our Civil War, and entitled The Origin of the Species. I could go on and on about Charles Darwin and how he got to his perspective, but I won't do that tonight. You can certainly ask me on the side, and I'll share my opinion of some of the things that led him down the wrong path. One of them is he had Lyell's book on the ancient earth, and he read it more than I think he did, certainly, his book, the Bible. There were the only two books he took on the journey of the Beagle to the Galapagos, and I think that's why he ultimately came to a new view. So, thus the theory of evolution is going to have a huge impact on dinosaur discoveries as well as their interpretations during this time period. So then comes this time period called the Great Dinosaur Rush. And I love the story about this because it takes place mostly nearby in western United States. The Great Dinosaur Rush ultimately comes out of the popularity of dinosaurs. People want to see more. The sculptures are a hit at the fair in London. They want to know more. They want to see more published. Well, to do that, you've got to have more specimens. And so this particular time period arises in which they go out looking for not just bones, but they need to find something that's more complete so we can have a better picture of what dinosaurs look like. And so new fossil sites were being reported, and bone hunters flocked to excavation sites. And in turn, the museums offered huge bounties to find them some of the best specimens they possibly could. It was a highly competitive market. And if you were willing to go out and do so, this was in competition with the Great Gold Rush here in California. You could either come out here and fight off literally tens of thousands of people trying to find the same thing, or you can go compete with about 20 of the best in the Northwest, in the Dakotas, and in Colorado, and you could go really cash in if you could find one of these dinosaur fossils. The thing was, not many people knew how to go look for these, and so it was a difficult situation for just the average prospector. But it was out of this that the study of paleontology, the study of ancient life, began. It was driven by the dollar. And let me tell you, when Jurassic World grosses $500 million in one weekend, it's still about the dollar. And that's something we're going to come back and see here in this study. So the Bone Wars begins. And the Bone Wars was a great rush for dinosaur bones to find these specimens, and it really had its beginnings in the United States, in the western United States, in fact, during the Gilded Age of U.S. history. It was marked between a heated rivalry between two prospectors between 1877 and 1892. One would go on to be the head of the geology department of a major university on the East Coast, and the other one would become the director of the United States Geologic Survey. So not only was there a chance to go out and make some money, There was a chance to make notoriety of your name and to become a person of distinction in the geologic realm. Well, these two individuals by the name of Nathaniel Marsh and Edward Cope. And when I say it was a bone war, it really was, because here's a picture of Marsh with his two money men, and then here's the gunmen to protect the sites. It was a serious situation, and I said it was big money. It was that big opportunity to make a name. Well, through the bone wars, a lot of interesting things happened and some great stories, and I encourage you to go read about them if you're a history buff. But what really came out of it was a great enlightenment and understanding of dinosaurs because of how many specimens these individuals ultimately found. 142 different dinosaur species was ultimately identified by just these two individuals. There were also other discoveries being made also in the western United States, but also world over. When people started to understand which rock formations to look at and started to find which was the best setting for finding these kind of dinosaur bones, then really there was a huge amount of discoveries taking place. And some of the greatest discoveries included what we call nearly complete in situ or in place specimens. Well, what does that mean? It means you get fortunate enough to find something completely intact, and when you remove the rock, you can see exactly how that animal looked. You don't have to guess how it goes back together. It's actually already still in place. Now, all the tissue and all the organs and all the skin has obviously eroded away, but the bones get preserved and ultimately what we call fossilized, meaning they change into rock. They're no longer just calcitic bones like we have today, but they actually become the rock itself. And it's a mineralization process, and if you really want, if you really need some sleeping material at night, I can recommend a couple of really good books that go through all the chemistry of that. But anyway, when you find these, you start to get an idea of what these animals look like. And then when you do that, you can start to imagine a little bit about what maybe the animal looked like by kind of getting some of the features hung on it, such as like muscle mass, possibly where the skin might be, and then you get a general shape of the animal. Well, from that, then you can get, well, what scientists love to do, we got to get to the artistic impression part. And that's when they start adding things like skin texture or color, or maybe such as Jurassic Park World and all of those different fanciful Hollywoodized stories, maybe how they sound, maybe how they flock like birds. All of those things become interpretive because at the end of the day, that's what you started with. And that's all you're going to have. That's the only thing that's going to typically be preserved in the rock record is the bone. Now, there are some impressions that are found sometimes, and one thing that's changing today, we used to think that these things were like dinosaurs, or excuse me, like reptiles, and that they had a scaly or maybe even a leathery type skin, maybe like an elephant even. But you know, today they're finding that more and more of these things may have had either feathers or some kind of frill material on them. And they try to use that as an interpretation towards the impression that birds ultimately evolved from dinosaurs. But what's really happening today is they're starting to find them on far too many animals, and now it's kind of busting up the idea that they had, and it's really creating some controversy. Well, let's get to the geologic time portion here. So where did dinosaurs fit in the rock record? Well, they fit in this little section here called the Mesozoic. Here we are, way up here at the very top. But you go back to 65 million years ago, back to about 245, 250 million years ago, and you have the Cretaceous, the Jurassic, and the Triassic. And what's interesting is, we hear about Jurassic Park, but unfortunately most of the dinosaurs actually are Triassic dinosaurs, and that's one misconception in the movie. They get wrong, but they were cooler dinosaurs earlier in the day, so they used those, but the Jurassic name stuck, so why change it? Just a minor add-on for tonight's lesson. But geologic time uses ultimately certain geologic principles to come up with this dating process. I'm going to give you geologic dating 101, and that's as far as we're going to go tonight. How do they get to these dates? Well, they get to these dates by, first of all, identifying the rock strata of which has what they call an index fossil, meaning a certain fossil is unique to a certain rock and it's found globally. So for instance, the dinosaurs are found in the Mesozoic rock, certain ones Triassic, certain ones Jurassic, some Cretaceous. Some can actually be across over all of those. But what we do find is we don't find necessarily dinosaurs into what's called the Tertiary or Cenozoic. some reason they just aren't preserved in the rock record anymore. And so the interesting thing is you take that index fossil, such as a dinosaur or other things like a marine fossil, and you ultimately associate it with this rock strata, and you correlate it through what's called stratigraphy around the world, and then you go out and you do radiometric dating. Well, radiometric dating is looking at certain isotopes, and everybody thinks of uranium. Well, that's not necessarily the one they use. They actually use strontium, rubidium, tritium, all kinds of different things. We think about carbon. Carbon actually only works back to 100,000 years supposedly, so it actually will not work in the case of the dinosaur. So that's important. You have to know that certain isotopes have certain half-lives and have certain limitations, so you actually need to know what rock strata you're in before you can do the dating to get the number you're looking for. And I've sent in rock for radiometric dating, and guess what? If you don't fill in the blank saying which rock formation you're in an approximate time reference, they won't give you a result, because they need to know which one to test for so that you can get a number. Because if they just do a random and use strontium, rubidium, uranium, and all the others, they're going to come back with different results all over the place because each of them give you a different result. So what's happening? You got to tell them which rock layer you have so you can get the date, and then you have to have the index fossil to know which rock layer you're in so you can actually know how to date. What do we call that? We call that circular logic, because ultimately everything is based on everything else. And at the end of the day, you still have to punch an assumption in there or else you can't get to a number. It's a failure. It's a true failure. And trust me, it's a difficult situation to deal with, even in my field, because everybody wants to use radiometric dating because they think it really empowers them. But again, they got to build in all the assumptions to even punch out a number that they're looking for. And you know what? With a little tweaking, you can get whatever number you want. And that's the facts. And it's difficult to deal with, but that's what everybody seems to hang their hat on. So that's Age Dating 101. I'll give you a link later on to a whole lesson I do on that that's posted on Green Oak's website out of Arlington, Texas. And we won't have a chance to do that this weekend, but there's some more information there for you. So let's talk about the fossil succession. This is also very interesting. So when it comes to indexing, radiometric dating, we call that actual dating, meaning we got to come up with an actual number to associate an age. So for instance, if I'm wanting to know the actual age of the Civil War, I would go back and I'd check the textbooks and I'd find that it's 1861 to 1865. If I wanted to know about the Revolutionary War, I'd go back in, check the textbooks. I could find the certain dates for that. But then there's what's called relative dating, which means I just put things in order. When did this come? When did this come? When did this come? And it doesn't necessarily worry about the actual dates so much as it's important to know what is the order. Well, that's important in evolution, because when it comes to fossils, if you want to know the evolution of certain species, as is taught in the classrooms today, you need to know the order to know which one came first, so as to know which one evolved from earlier species. And so, in fossil succession, we put together these particular timelines, and what you're seeing here is the Triassic down here at the bottom. We see the Jurassic here in the middle, these three colors, and then the greens are the Cretaceous, and then everything beyond that, which they call the mass extinction line, of 65 million years. And what you're seeing is a representation of different species in the dinosaur family, and the red is indicative of when that fossil is found in the rock record. And so we do stacking stratigraphy, stacking of the rocks, and we determine when is this, and how long the spans are based on how many rock layers we find that species. Anywhere you see it dotted, we find it early, we don't find it at all, and then we find it again a little bit later on. Over here on the far right is birds. Supposedly they start around the beginning of the Triassic or Cretaceous, and they go all the way through to modern day birds today. So we do find those fossils back in this particular rock unit, and that's why they make those assumptions. But here's what's interesting. How do we know what is related to what? Well, today we would use genome or DNA testing. Well, we don't have that available. Actually, we do to some degree, but very limited when it comes to dinosaurs. And so what do? Well, they start making assumptions based on how animals look, how you would characterize them, their bone structures, types of bones, but also the order of things in which they come. And so, watch closely, they make interpretations, and they start to build their own family tree. And when they start to build this family tree, they start to make assumptions of how far that animal should be found back into history. And you know what's scarier than that is? That there are certain hypothetical animals that should be out there to connect animals that don't even and haven't even been discovered yet. We're going to assume those are out there because we need them to make evolution work. Now that's scary. And that's not science. That is fantasy when you start doing those kinds of assumptions. And so they build this huge tree and they teach this as fact. And at the end of the day, that's all they've got to work with. That's all they have to work with. And so who has the right to make those assumptions? Who has the right to build that relationship? Who has the right? Well, it's the higher-ups in the universities that have the most so-called credibility, who scratch each other's back, allow you a little interpretation here, if you allow me a little interpretation here, let me publish this and I'll let you publish this. And guess what? After a while, it's just a good old boy system, but on a higher education level. And it's scary to know that they are the ones driving everything that we know about dinosaurs and discoveries today. The great thing is Chinese now are getting involved and they don't care what they've invested and they'll throw anything out there to get it published and they're just really rocking the boat. And I appreciate them right now because they're helping. So, what does the evolutionary tree look like? Well, they start to build all those relationships, and this is what it looks like in the textbooks. They start trying to associate. Certain dinosaurs walk on fours, certain dinosaurs walk on twos, some have long tails, some have long necks, and then there's the birds, and I'll tell you now, all of these species now are seeming to be found with feathers, and it's just really kind of rocking this up. If they find anything over here with feathers, they're going to break the evolutionary tree. And I'm eager to see what kind of discoveries come about in the next couple of decades because I think it's possible. I hope it's possible because I would like to see them sweat a little while because they've made us sweat long enough for the last 50 to 100 years. But we'll see what happens. So, dinosaur extinction. This question always comes up. What happened to the dinosaurs? Well, there's a lot of hypotheses. There's supposedly been a huge meteor or asteroid impact that killed them off. There's supposedly been volcanism with hydrogen sulfide gases that have killed them off. There's been the proposal of global heating. There's the proposal of global cooling. And any one of these situations supposedly has ended the dinosaurs. But you know what? There are some that actually believe in this idea. The dinosaurs never made it on the ark and therefore they don't exist today. Well, that's what we need to test tonight. We need to determine whether or not that's actually true before we just propose it and stand on it, because we don't want to propose something like the scientists have done based on fantasy. We need to know for sure, and there is a way to know for sure. Well, let's briefly review. What have we learned so far? First, discoveries were correctly identified in the late 1700s into the 1800s. It's a relatively young science. Dinosaurs lived supposedly 65 to 245 million years ago. They evolved from a common ancestor. Now, I didn't talk about that, but I already said there's a hypothesized animals out there. Their great-great-great-grandfather from which they all came from is hypothesized. They don't even have him. And they don't even know how he connects back to the rest of the animals. Supposedly to lizards, somehow reptiles, we don't know. But it's hypothesized today. They're supposedly the predecessor in the evolution of birds. They died out during some sort of massive extinction. We would call that catastrophism, by the way. We talked about that last night. Never coexisted with humans. This will be very important as we conclude our lesson here tonight. Humans supposedly didn't come into the scene evolutionary-wise until 10,000 years ago. Hominids around 100,000 years ago. Icons of Darwinian theory of evolution and proof of an ancient Earth. We're going to test that. And there's no room for creation or intelligent design. And as I said, that is hypothesized if you can make sure this has never happened. And if that has ever happened, if there's ever been dinosaurs coexisting with humans, the whole evolutionary process breaks down. Because the difference between 65 million years ago to 10,000 years ago is huge. There's no room for error for the evolutionists. So let's test it. Supposedly, there have been no eyewitness testimonies of humans seeing dinosaurs. Out of Chapman's book, In the Days of Dinosaurs, published in 1959, still referred to today, dinosaurs lived many, many millions of years ago. That was before there were any people. No human being ever saw a dinosaur. All these great lizards disappeared millions of years before men and women and children appeared on the earth. Here's Wikipedia, great source of information. I told you I'd probably quote from some of this at some point because, hey, if you want to get your finger on the pulse of how our culture sees things, go to Wikipedia. Wikipedia says the popular ideals of dinosaurs have many misconceptions reinforced by films, books, comics, television shows, and other media. Typical errors include prehistoric humans living with dinosaurs. Remember, dinosaurs weren't discovered until the 17 and 1800s. Now let's test it. The Neanderthal. Sculptures of prehistoric animals fighting in Bernafal Cave in France is renowned for Neanderthal artifacts, meaning the Neanderthals loved to carve on the walls and draw pictures. Well, they drew this one. And what you see here is an animal on the right, possibly an animal here on the left, and the archaeological sketch of this particular picture looks like this. Looks like possibly some elephant-like creature on the right, and something having the head like a lizard with two smaller arms. Could it be this? An allosaur, for instance, a dinosaur? Possibly, but hey, I understand. That's hard to see. It's hard to interpret. So let's see what else we can find. How about the Egyptians? And there are certain Mesopotamian cylinders or seals that are dated back to 3300 BC. Audra and I had the chance to see these late last year, and they're on display at the Louvre in Paris. And there's actually more than what I'm going to show you here, but ultimately these little seals were used to seal letters and certain government documents, and they would do them artistically in certain ways to ultimately imprint on the wax. Well, here's one. Here's what the little seal looks like. They're the cylinder that rotates and makes the seal. As you roll it around, it makes a nice little decor. And notice you've got a body, 4 legs, long neck with a head, small head, and a long tail. Is it possibly an apastosaur? Well, I don't know of any other animal that it could look like in the modern time. How about this? In Herculopolis, slate plates were discovered at around 3000 BC. And they look like this. Here's obviously some Egyptians. There's obviously some slaves. I don't think they're necessarily Israelites. But there are some interesting things going on this plate. And what's that? It looks like this. Again, body, long legs, long tail, small head. Here's another one. Again, body, 4 legs, long tail, really long neck, small head. Again, exactly the same idea, just in different artistic impressions. And again, they look like an apastosaur. How about in the western United States? Petroglyphs at Natural Bridges, Utah, drawn by Anasazi Indians around 150 BC to somewhere around 1200 AD. Big error of margin, but definitely before the 1700s. Here's one, human being, and what is that? Body, 4 legs, long neck, small head, long tail. Petroglyphs found at Havasupai Canyon, Arizona. This one up here has all kinds of animals. But look at this guy down here. He's kind of interesting. What is he? Looks like small head, long neck, body. This time, 2 legs, possibly small arms, you don't know, but a long tail. And certainly there are animals in the dinosaur record that look like that. How about in Peru? In 1571, Spanish conquistadors reported of Inca ceremonial burial stones with strange creatures carved on them. Over 1,100 of these stones were found in tombs in Peru during the 1930s. Here's a human being with a bird on his shoulder, riding something that has a big body, 4 legs, long tail, long neck, small head. How about this one? Human being with a knife or some kind of weapon, trying to fight off something that's got some teeth, a head, long neck, 2 smaller arms, and again, this is standing on as a biped, but a long tail, being attacked by something that looks similar. How about over here? All kinds of animals. Here's a snake. Here's some, again, a human being riding atop a long-necked, small-headed animal, big body, 4 legs, long tail. My question so far is, how did anyone before the 1600s know what these animals look like? Because no bone reconstructions have ever been made yet. And certainly the science hasn't been born. Let's go a little further. Australia. The Aboriginal tribes of North Queensland, Australia relate stories of something called Yaru, A creature we used to inhabit rainforest water holes, which had a long neck and a large body with flippers. Here's the Aborigine, obviously with blowguns, trying to, what I would think, kill this animal. And what does it look like? Well, it looks like a plesiosaur. Very similar. Look at the flippers, look at the long neck, look at the tail. It looks just like modern interpretations of plesiosaur today. Mexico. Nearly 33,000 ceramic figurines were found buried at the foot of El Toro mountain, that is the bull, near Encambro, Mexico, identified as pre-classical Chipicura culture, which is dated 800 BC to around 200 AD. The silent years of the Bible through the early beginnings of the church. Notice again the figurines, of which again a very popular animal we're seeing depicted in a lot of these different cultures and artistry. And what again? Probably an apatosaur or brontosaur. How about Cambodia? Of course, I really wish Jonathan could get over and get some more pictures of this, and I know it's already been photographed many times, and I hope he gets a chance to go see this. There's an 800-year-old Buddhist temple. In fact, he's got it on his letterhead, for what you all see going around talking about the Cambodian work. This particular temple here, it's a Buddhist temple and palaces located deep in the jungle and the remnants of the Khmer civilization at what's called Angkor Wat. And in one of these particular tombs, buried back here in the palace, there's this facade, and you can see, obviously, one of the early Khmers down here at the bottom, something here in the middle, but there's an animal here at the top that's very interesting. Here it is. Some people say it's a hippo. Well, the problem is I've never seen these plates on the back of a hippo, and especially all the way down its tail. But I have seen it on something that looks like that, a stegosaur. It's the only animal I know that has those kinds of plates along its spine. How about Italy? This is a great one. First century Roman mosaics were recovered from an archaeological site at Pompeii. It was ultimately Pompeii, the history of it is at 79 AD, Pompeii along the Grecian coast was ultimately buried in volcanic ash after a huge volcanic eruption at Vesuvius. And what ultimately happens through this eruption is it just buries the city. And it encapsulates everything until really just in the last 40 to 50 years when they started uncovering the city archaeologically, and they found well-preserved things, such as, for instance, human casts in their sleeping position as they were, obviously their lives were taken that very night as the volcanic eruption encapsulated them, animals, all kinds of wonderful things to really kind of understand what that civilization was like and captured in time, just frozen in time. What was also interesting is they found these tapestries. Well, here's one, and look at this. Small children play with some very interesting looking animals. This one looks like a huge dinosaur or a huge lizard with a big frill down its back. Here's something over here. I hope it's not an alligator. Probably wouldn't bode well for the child, but it's something that looks lizard-like. And then some kind of animal over here as well with a child's head in it. Not recommended. But over here, here's a couple of locals with spears and shields. And they've got, again, a lizard-like creature captured here, or at least surrounded in a cave which they're trying to kill. Here's another one, yet again, hunters, one with a spear and a shield, another one with a large stone, trying to kill, again, another lizard-like creature. Very interesting. We know those aren't fraudulent because they were found very recently, and we know when Vesuvius buried that city. So these things were not created after the 1600s. China. We'll end on this as the last example. There's many more we could share, but this is one of my favorites. The dragon is a popular symbol in Chinese culture and is one of 12 real animals depicted on the Chinese zodiac. Here's the Chinese zodiac. Notice you got rabbit, tiger, oxen, rat, pig, dog, rooster, monkey, sheep, horse, snake, and there's dragon. Why would you put a dragon, a mythical creature, on a zodiac that has real animals? Unless you thought the dragon was real. That's why. Well, artifacts from the Shang Dynasty, which is 1100 to 1700 BC, came up with these beautiful jade figurines. And look how very closely these resemble a protoceratop with its large frill behind its skull. The only animal that looks like that at a large scale. Smaller scale, you can have horned lizards and things like that, but they look nothing like those animals. How about this one? A Cerolophus. There's a silver depiction of what looks like a modern or modernly known Cerulopus today. Now those are just amazing, and the quality of them is very high, and the representation cannot be mistaken. So why haven't we heard about this? Why isn't this kind of information making the news? Well, to be honest, the reason these artifacts are not publicized or well known is because it is a conscious attempt to suppress this type of information, since it goes against the modern paradigm of evolution. It goes against it. And I'll tell you now today, there are things found even in the geologic record, such as fossils, such as footprints, even some including human prints, and they are destroyed purposefully to keep that information hidden. And it's sad, but that is going on, and there are those who would stand up and would speak about these heinous situations. But the big reason is because billions of dollars are spent on evolution. It's a billion-dollar industry. Think about it. Textbooks, magazines, documentaries, TV shows, live animatronics on certain stages that come to your local cities, and then obviously blockbuster hits that make the movies. They are going to compete against the biblical worldview because they've already invested so much in their particular worldview. So let me finish with this tonight, and thank you for your patience, but now we got to get to the Bible. But I'll be brief because there's not a lot about it in there in the Bible, but there is some things that are worth noting. So first of all, the question is legendary dragon tails. We've read about them, we've heard about them, we certainly see them depicted in sculptures and many things today. The question is, and this is what World Book Encyclopedia speaks of, dragons of legend are strangely like actual creatures that have lived in the past. They are much like great reptiles or dinosaurs which inhabited the earth long before man was supposed to have appeared on earth. Dragons were generally evil and destructive. Every country had them in mythology. Well, did we not just see a lot of representation of a lot of countries that have some kind of artistic depiction of dinosaurs? Yes. So when they talk about dragon tails back in the ancient times, could they have been talking about possibly dinosaurs? Remember, the word dinosaur didn't come about until 1841. So here's a historical testimony. We believe in Alexander the Great. Well, let's see what Alexander the Great has to say. He reported that when he conquered what is now India in 326 BC, his soldiers were scared. First of all, what were these soldiers possibly scared of? This was one of the greatest fighting forces of their day. There wasn't a country that could stand up to them. And he says that they were scared by the great dragons that lived in the caves in the regions of India. Well, whatever these things were, they weren't lizards. They weren't even crocodiles. They were something so hideous and so terrifying that it obviously scared one of the greatest fighting forces of the Roman time. How about Marco Polo? Marco Polo visited China and said that the emperor was raising dragons to pull chariots in the parades. Well, how could that be? Dragons are figments of people's imagination. Those dragons, even though it's on the zodiac with 11 other real animals, surely that's fanciful. Well, no, Marco Polo spoke of it, and he wrote it down in his own annals. Again, dinosaur didn't appear until 1841, so the previous word should have been and had to be dragon. So here's one I want to share with you. This is a more recent dinosaur discovery. It was entitled Dracoryx hogwartsia. I think you can guess which movie that comes from. The person had obviously some enamorment to Harry Potter movies. He ultimately found a dinosaur skull and in South Dakota that is now on display in Indianapolis's Children's Museum. It went on display in 2004, still there today. And this is what the rendition of the dragon in the movie was. Here's what the skull that he found looks like, and of course you can see why he named it such. You can see the horns on it. And here is what's on display at the Indianapolis Museum. And it looks like a dinosaur, of course, but it's got a dragon-like skull, doesn't it? And of course you go to the artistic impression, which they try to get away from the dragon look. They try to give it this kind of skin tone and give it that kind of look. And so you can see the artistic impression is to try to disconnect those particular ideas. What's the biblical testimony? The dragon word that we find in the Old Testament is the word tannion. And so tannion is actually a word we find in the Bible, and we typically see it in Old King James as the word dragon. In Jeremiah chapter 14, verse 6, now remember, these are ancient writings. These are historical writings, and so I put the dates on there too to remember. These are long before the 1700s once again. Written in 600 BC, Jeremiah says, "And the wild asses did stand in the high places. They snuffed up the wind like dragons. Their eyes did fail because there was no grass." Now note that the word dragon in modern translations today is the word jackal. And we're going to come back and we're going to question this here in a little bit, but ultimately what's happened is the impact of evolutionary theory has taken such precedent as to even scare biblical scholars into calling things what they are. And they try to put it within the evolutionary paradigm. So what do? They can't use the word dragon because that would be mythical. And so they go with the word jackal, trying to avoid that. The problem is there's some inconsistency issues when it comes to context we'll see here in a moment. But here it is, and this is interesting because one of the questions we asked was how did dinosaurs become extinct? Well, here's one idea. It says the wild asses did stand in the high places, meaning the hilltops or mountains. They snuffed up the wind like dragons. So he's making a comparison to them. Their eyes did fail. What is that? That's a nice way of saying they died because there was no grass, meaning they ran out of food. These wild asses died because there wasn't enough food to sustain them. What's the comparison? Dragons, dinosaurs died also because there wasn't enough food supply to sustain them. They're large animals. They certainly would have needed that. Isaiah 43 verse 20, Isaiah was written in around 700 BC. Isaiah says, "The beasts of the field shall honor me, the dragons and the owls, because I give water in the wilderness and river in the desert to give drink to my people, my chosen." Again, dragon is replaced with jackal in modern translations. And I'm meaning to put something together on this, but this word owl used in the Old Testament, especially whenever it's in connotation, if you ever find the word dragon and owls together, it's very interesting, and I think it actually has a very interesting connotation to flying dinosaurs that I'm still trying to work on. But I need some help from some Hebrew scholars. So if we have any in the Brotherhood, let me know right away, because I need to find out a little bit more about that before I can be so assertive on that idea. But the interesting thing is, here it again is the word dragon, tannion. And it says here that just like the beasts of the field, that he talks about the giving of waters in the wilderness, rivers in the desert, to give drink to my people, my chosen. Now notice the interesting thing is that there's a change in the subject matter from the wild beasts and the dragons to that of the inhabitants or the human beings. And just like waters that give sustenance to the animals, they also, then these animals give sustenance to people. So what's the other possibility as far as extinction of dinosaurs? Well, it could be that they were just hunted out. The Native Americans, and as well as especially those who were making conquest into the western territories of the United States, almost hunted the buffalo to extinction. Why? Because it was a large animal, it was slower, it was easier to capture, and it fed a lot more people. So it makes sense that the biggest animals to go first would certainly help to supply abundance of food for human populations. Psalm 74, 13 and 14, written around 1000 BC by David, says, "Thou didst divide the sea by the strength, thou breakest the head of the dragons in the waters." Notice it's talking about a water-style dinosaur here. "Thou breakest the heads of Leviathan," a very specific dinosaur, "in pieces, and gavest him to be meat to the people inhabiting the wilderness." Again, supporting the idea of sustenance of food. And again, in this particular case, the word dragon is translated as serpents or sea monsters in some modern translations. And now let's get down to two last verses or passages. And this one's Job chapter 40. Job chapter 40 in verses 15 through 24, written again around 1000 BC. The word recorded there is, "Look now at behemoth." Now behemoth is a very specific kind of animal. In the modern translations, it's translated hippopotamus. Now I want you to envision a hippopotamus for a moment here. And as we go through this description, you be the judge of whether or not hippopotamus works for this passage. He says, "Look now at the behemoth," this is God speaking to Job, "which I made along with you." When did they have creation of this particular animal? in the days of the creative works in Genesis chapter 1, with the mammals, in the days also of human beings, the first man, Adam, being created. He eats grass like an ox. See, now his strength is in his hips, and his power is in his stomach muscles. He moves his tail like a cedar. Anyone seen a ropey tail on the back of a hippopotamus? This is not going to match already. But it's like a cedar, he says. He says, the sinews, or the tight fitting of his skin, of his thighs, are tightly knit. His bones are like beams of bronze, his ribs like bars of iron. He is the first of the ways of God. Only he who made him can bring near his sword. How fast do you think a person can come up on a hippopotamus? I mean, I know they're a fast animal, and probably a lot of people misjudge their speed. But they're not impossible to catch, and especially with a sword. Surely the mountains yield food for him. Well, last I checked, hippopotamuses live in rivers, and all the beasts of the field play there. He lies under the lotus trees in the covert of reeds and marsh. The lotus trees cover him with their shade. The willows by the brooks surround him. Indeed, the river may rage, yet he is not disturbed. He is confident, though the Jordan gushes into his mouth, though he takes it in his eyes, or one pierces his nose with a snare. Whatever this animal is so large as that the Jordan River, during high flow, isn't a bother to this animal. Well, how many animals could that be? Well, a hippopotamus, first of all, there's no hippos living in the Jordan, to my knowledge today, nor has there ever been. But an animal of this size might be something like that. We've already seen artistic depictions in ancient times of this very animal. And a pastosaur, what we call a brontosaur. And that is an animal large enough to stand in the Jordan during full flow and not be moved, and in fact just walk right across it like it was nothing. And so we got to think about that. And we got to think about that it's possible. Now I'm just hypothesizing. I don't know for sure. And I wouldn't dare go out and say that absolutely that's the animal. But it's certainly something like that. Job 41 talks about yet another dinosaur. This time it's Leviathan. He says, and of course, again, let's think about it. Modern translations use the word crocodile for this animal. Let's think about it for a moment. Can you draw out Leviathan with a hook? Or snare his tongue with a line which you can lower? Now, I've seen crocodiles caught on all of these swamp people television shows. I've even seen them wrestled with. I would say whatever this animal is can't be that. Verse 2, can you put a reed through his nose or pierce his jaw with a hook? Will he make many supplications for you? Will he speak softly to you? Will he make a covenant with you? Will you take him as a servant forever? Will you play with him as with a bird? Or will you leash him for your maidens? Will your companions make a banquet for him? Will they apportion him among the merchants? Meaning, can you cut him up and even supply him in the marketplace? Can you fill his skin with harpoons or his head with fishing spears? Lay your hand on him, remember the battle. Never do it again. Indeed, any hope of overcoming him is false. Shall one not be overwhelmed at the sight of him? No one is so fierce that he would dare stir him up. Who then is able to stand against me? What's this animal? I can imagine that being scary. And certainly, Hollywood takes full advantage of that in the movies that are depicted today. Now again, this is assumptuous. It's asserting certain hypotheses, but crocodile isn't the right animal. Just as hippopotamus wasn't the right animal for Job 40 for Behemoth. The point is that when history shows that human beings have seen these animals, and when the Bible, an ancient text of numerous writings, speaks about animals that we cannot connect with today that are of such large enormity and of certain depictions that certainly sound like the proper term, dragon, tanyan, could possibly be dinosaur today, they were written from a factual standpoint of a real animal that could be seen, observed, and people could take note of. And they were described and compared to real animals, as we just saw a moment ago. And that's important because context is important in this subject. But so is also the historical references to these animals. Well, what about scientific evidence today? Well, when it comes to geologic time and evolutionary theory, they are based on numerous assumptions. And we're going to tap into that consistently throughout this weekend. True science, though, allows for the evidence to speak for itself without forcing the data to fit preconceived parameters. Meaning, if human beings have seen these animals, then they need to rethink how they put their theory together. And that's the problem. They don't want to. Because the moment you take away evolution and you introduce the idea of a potential intelligent designer, a master engineer, a God of whom human beings are accountable to, is the day they stand judged. And the atheist doesn't want to deal with that fact. The atheist doesn't want to be faced with the reality of a potential condemnation. They don't want to be accountable to anyone. And that's why they push their agendas. That's why they push it in the school systems, because the more they can convert to their view, they can get the mass on their side and ultimately overwhelm any others that have any other opinion. And it's dangerous. It's truly dangerous. And it's not just dangerous to the world, it's dangerous to our young people because of how impressionable it is. And it truly is impressionable. It's hard to really grasp these things, as amazing and fantastic as they are to imagine, and to now have it Hollywoodized in movies to really kind of connect in a virtual world of what it must be like. It will draw you in. And we've got to be careful about that. Because then when they get to the schools, high school and university level, well, they're out to do one thing, and that's convert you away from a biblical worldview to an evolutionary, atheistic worldview. And that's what we're fighting out there today. And that's why we take the time to look at some of these things today. At the end of the day, the scientific community, the modern one, dismisses all evidence that does not fit the evolutionary paradigm, especially when it has reference to creation or intelligent design. And so we're going to have to defend against that. And it's not going to go away anytime soon. And we've got to prepare our young people. And we need to do all we can to be educated on it. Because even if it doesn't bother us, you need to understand young minds are highly impressionable. And they're fighting that. They're dealing with the difficulties of that. And if they're in certain industries such as mine, you're fighting it every day. And let me tell you, when waves beat upon a rock long enough, sometimes that rock will break down. And it's difficult. It's a difficult thing, and it's something, though, we've got to be prepared for. Let me leave you with this. Psalm 104, verse 24. We noted this passage the other night. It's a beautiful passage, the whole of this chapter. But in verse 24, it says, O Lord, how manifold are thy works in wisdom. Thou hast made them all. The earth is full of thy riches. I would include dinosaurs and every creature in that particular perspective. When we take the time to look at the things God has created, to understand them in the proper perspective, and to look at how amazingly these things were written about in the ancient times, you know, to me it's just eye-opening. And you have to come to the conclusion and accept that these things are wonderfully made, created by God. They have purpose. And we need to appreciate what that purpose is. And that purpose is to point us back to the Creator, God, and to respect Him for His position and authority, and to also respect His plan for mankind. Tonight, if you're one that is subject to the gospel call, either desiring to become a child of God or one that is needing to make corrections in your life, we want to afford you that opportunity to come forward, make your wishes known, and we will then assist you while we stand and while we sing this invitation song.